All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I'm going to do part 3 of a Mindgasms vlog today on the book The History of Sexuality Part 1 by Michel Foucault. He did what is called historiography in many of his videos that are often put into the category of philosophy. Historiography is basically the history of ideas, concepts, and perspectives. In Discipline and Punish, which I made a video about a while ago, I'll add a link for that somewhere in the video and then in the description for this, Foucault writes about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward criminals. In Madness and Civilization, which I will make a video or write a blog about later, Foucault talks about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward people with mental disorders. In all of the handful or so of his books that I've read, Foucault seems to analyze how these cultural attitudes have changed from approximately the 1600s to the 1800s and through to today. He also uses a multifactoral analysis. He explains the contributing causes that led to behaviors and attitudes changing from many different angles. There are many reasons that attitudes towards certain groups of people and behaviors change throughout history. All right. So in this next quote, Foucault discusses the dominant narrative about power relations in terms of sex in this next paragraph. Quote, the negative relation. It never establishes any relation between power and sex that is not negative. Rejection, exclusion, refusal, blockage, concealment, or mask. Where sex and pleasure are concerned, power can quote unquote do nothing but to say no to them. What it produces, if anything, is absences and gaps. It overlooks elements, introduces discontinuities, separates what is joined, and marks off boundaries. Its effects take the general form of limit and lack, unquote. What Foucault means here is that our current culture moralizes about power whenever we discuss it in relation to sex and pleasure. Power is bad in any context when you're enjoying yourself in any way, including during sex. One sexual partner having power over the other is always seen as bad, as if this always and only has to do with S&M. The first person having power over the second person, or the third or fourth, whatever floats your boat, always means that the person without power is being harmed. This is bad even if someone derives pleasure from pain. No one talks about power in a positive light whenever sex or pleasure in general are mentioned. Sitting on the couch and watching TV cannot be connected to power in a positive way. People do not and are not allowed to enjoy being overpowered during sex. In reality, we know this is false. Sitting on the couch and watching TV is a form of surrendering your power over yourself. It's a way of letting go of your discipline in order to truly relax. We also all understand that some people like to be dominated during sex. Straight guys know all too well that some girls like it rough. I'm sure that some guys do too, whether they're straight, gay, bisexual, or anything else. It makes sense that Foucault would bring up this point about how power is always looked at negatively in terms of sex, since he was into S&M. In this next paragraph, Foucault talks about the sheer and all-encompassing power that institutions such as the government, laws, and family have on our cultural perceptions of sexuality as a terrible taboo. Quote, the uniformity of the apparatus. The power over sex is exercised in the same way at all levels, from top to bottom, in its overall decisions and its capillary interventions alike. Whatever the devices or institutions on which it relies, it acts in a uniform and comprehensive manner. It operates according to the simple and endlessly reproduced mechanisms of law, taboo, and censorship. From state to family, from prince to father, from the tribunal to the small change of everyday punishments, from the agencies of social domination to the structures that constitute the subject himself, one finds a general form of power, varying in scale alone. This form is the law of transgression and punishment, with its interplay of licit and illicit, whether one attributes to it the form of the prince who formulates rights, of the father who forbids, of the censor who enforces silence, or of the master who states the law. In any case, one schematizes power in a juridical form, and one defines its effects as obedience. Confronted by a power that is law, the subject who is constituted as subject, who is quote-unquote subjected, is he who obeys. To the formal homogeneity of power in these various instances corresponds the general form of submission in which one who is constrained by it, whether the individual in question is the subject opposite the monarch, the citizen opposite the state, the child opposite the parent, or the disciple opposite the master. A legislative power on one side and an obedient subject on the other. Foucault is saying here that the institutions influencing our perceptions about sex are an apparatus. Culture is a system of institutions that most of us obey the majority of the time because they create the structure of our society. Power over sex is exercised from top to bottom in a uniform way. From the highest peak to the lowest valley of Jordan Peterson's social hierarchy or Sam Harris's moral landscape, every complex facet controls our cultural perceptions. In the same way, the mechanisms of law, taboo, and censorship are endlessly replicated in every cultural archetype. Whether you're a family, prince, princess, mother, or father, you probably obey the law for the most part, stay away from taboos, and censor yourself and/or others according to the accepted language in every environment. Power over our perceptions of sex is carried out in a very similar way to a legal system, and we obey it. We bow to the power of culture. Society has people who have power and those who obey it. A monarch has his subjects. Citizens are controlled by the state. Children obey their parents, and masters have power over their disciples. This next quote is what Foucault says to clarify what he means by power. It's important because once you understand Foucault's actual definition that he explicitly states, you see public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson strawmanning all over the place when they talk about Foucault. Here's the super long quote. Quote, hence the objective is to analyze a certain form of knowledge regarding sex, not in terms of repression or law, but in terms of power. But the word power is apt to lead to a number of misunderstandings. Misunderstandings with respect to its nature, its form, and its unity. By power, I do not mean capital P power as a group of institutions and mechanisms that ensure the subservience of the citizens of a given state. By power, I do not mean either a mode of subjugation which, in contrast to violence, has the form of the rule. Finally, I do not have in mind a general system of domination exerted by one group over another, a system whose effects, through successive derivations, pervade the entire social body. The analysis made in terms of power must not assume that the sovereignty of the state, the form of the law, or the overall unity of a domination are given at the outset. Rather, these are the only terminal forms power takes. It seems to me that power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and in which constitute their own organization, as the process which, through ceaseless struggle and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them, as the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, or on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another, and lastly, as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of the law, in the various social hegemonies. Power's condition of possibility, or in any case, the viewpoint which permits one to understand its exercise, even in its more quote-unquote peripheral effects, which also makes it possible to use its mechanisms as a grid of intelligibility of the social order, must not be sought in the primary existence of a central point, in a unique form of sovereignty from which secondary and descendant forms would emanate. It is the moving substrate of force relations which, by virtue of their inequality, constantly engender states of power, but the latter are always local and unstable. The omnipresence of power, not because it has the privilege of consolidating everything under its invincible unity, but because it is produced from one moment to the next, at every point, or rather, in every relation from one point to another. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. And capital P power, insofar as it is permanent, repetitious, inert, and self-reproducing, is simply the overall effect that emerges from all of these mobilities, the concatenation that rests on each of them and seeks in turn to arrest their movement. Concatenation basically means a system, by the way, if you didn't know that. One needs to be nominalistic, no doubt. Power is not an institution and not a structure. Neither is it a certain strength we are endowed with. It is the name that one attributes to a complex strategical situation in a particular society. Foucault is explaining in minute detail that what he does not mean by power, along with what he does mean. He's very clear about his own definition and explicitly says that power is not what we know public intellectuals use as strawmans of his positions. In that long quote are all the complete misinterpretations of Foucault's definitions of power that we hear all the time from people like Jordan Peterson. He explicitly wrote that he does not mean exactly what Peterson says he explicitly does mean. Sex is being analyzed in terms of power in the quote, but Foucault is not claiming that power is capital P power, a system of institutions that forces citizens to obey the state. He's not talking about subjugation to a ruler. His definition is not an entire social system of groups dominating other groups. Foucault's analysis does not take the state laws or the unity of both as given. Those are just the only fatal forms that power takes. This part is really interesting because he literally is saying that the state and laws are terminal forms of power. Terminal is the word that he uses in the quote. It sure makes no sense at all that people call Foucault a Marxist or a postmodern neo-Marxist, since he is talking in the complete opposite way. Marxists advocate for more state control and more laws. Foucault sounds much more like an anarchist with the assertion that the unity of the sovereign state and laws are the only fatal forms of power. Not only is there an obvious added implication that less state control and less laws are better, he's saying that they are inherently flawed and doomed. Marxists generally claim that capitalism is designed to fail, so they advocate for more government control. Foucault is arguing that the government apparatus itself is fatally flawed. Foucault then goes on to give 4 slightly different but related definitions of power. That's part of why it's so hard to criticize him. His own definition is hard to nail down. However, you can tell when people have not actually read his writing when they define Foucault's terms in ways that he explicitly said are not what he means. He offers plenty of valid ways to interpret his own views, and those can all be critiqued in many ways that don't require propping up strawmans. Anyway, the first definition of power that Foucault offers is basically an interconnected system of organized force relations. That means that he sees power as sort of a mechanism with moving parts that exert pressure on each other because they are inherently interconnected. The next way he defines it is as a process that transforms or reverses force relations through ceaseless struggle. So you can already see how Foucault's definitions build on each other, right? One definition is dependent on the other. And we'll see with his last one that the interconnected process/definition is divided into different parts that constitute the whole. The way that he defines the interconnected system is an interconnected system in itself. It's meta as fuck, man. So now we're seeing that not only is power an interconnected system of force relations, it's also a process that transforms or reverses that interconnected system of force relations through ceaseless struggle. But that's not all. Foucault still adds at least 2 more layers of complexity. Foucault's next definition of power is basically the way that these the way that these interconnected force relations support one another, forming a system. So power is the support behind a process of ceaseless struggle that transforms or reverses an interconnected system of force relations into another system. Power is looked at in a slightly different way right after this description in the same paragraph. This is part of why Foucault can be so confusing to some people. He writes about too many related but different subjects at once. What he does not mean by power, parallel complex definitions of his own, and his reiteration of the latter are all in the same fucking paragraph. Foucault goes on to give another series of similar but slightly different complex and interconnected definitions of power, which can be linked to the way he explained what he means in the first place. He says that power can also be looked at as the disjointed parts and contradictions that separate these interconnected force relations from each other. After that, Foucault defines power as the strategies in which these disjunctions and contradictions take effect and are institutionally crystallized in their embodiment within the state apparatus. So, power can be seen as the strategies in which disjointed parts and contradictions that isolate interconnected force relations take effect, are crystallized and embodied in the state apparatus. Before going on to describe power in even more complex ways, he stresses that it should not be sought for the existence of a central point, or to form a kind of sovereignty from which secondary forms would emanate. This is another important part because Foucault is basically saying that he has an anti-authoritarian perspective on power. He thinks that no one should seek power in order to form a sovereign state or become a ruler yourself, exercising your influence all the way down the social hierarchy. No one should seek power in order to control others. This is another aspect of Foucault that people almost always get wrong. They claim that he is saying that power is always bad, which he is not. He is claiming that power should not be used in an authoritarian way, so you can rule over all the lowly peasants. He has a problem with the way that governments use it because he believes that it is an interconnected system of exerting power over others if you use power in that way. Foucault goes on to describe power in a similar way as he had before, but with an added caveat. This is another example of his series of complex, slightly different, and interconnected definitions building on each other. He says that power is a moving web of unequal force relations that create states of power. This is similar to what he said before, but he clarifies that these are local and stabilized. So yes, an interconnected system of force relations engenders types of power, but these are each in only one location and they operate in a functional way. They are the secondary states of power that are created by a sovereign state or ruler. These points can operate independently with total efficiency because they are the new systems that were created by the moving substrate of force relations. The apparatus is an interconnected system of force relations that creates new systems of interconnected force relations. I explained that part earlier. I know that this sounds like a paradox. How can power be an interconnected system with isolated states? If the different strands of the web are local, how can they be interconnected? Well, what Foucault means here is that power is a complex system, but there are multiple isolated points that form the moving substrate. There are many individual and constantly shifting parts. The web is always morphing and changing shape because it contains complex systems within complex systems that are influencing each other in varying ways. Power is everywhere, but not because there is one massive and complex system that controls everything in only one way. Power flows in multiple directions. Each strand of the moving web is always influencing every other strand. The force relations endlessly move back and forth throughout the interconnected and complex system. Power itself is not an oppressive hierarchy. It's not an inherently top-to-bottom organization, with power only emanating from one point. Each isolated point of the moving substrate affects every other point in stronger or weaker ways at different times, depending on how much influence they get from every other point. So it's a really complex metaphor that you have to sit and think about to fully understand. Every moving part of the apparatus of power is its own interconnected system. It is trying to stop every other point in order to exert as much of its own power over other parts as possible. These effects are what make power permanent, repetitious, inert, and self-reproducing. It's permanent because this constantly shifting web of interconnected systems within interconnected systems is always changing and morphing into new webs. This system is endlessly transforming into a new system because each section is always trying to exert as much force as possible over every other section. Power is repetitious because this process never ends. It's always the same type of functions that are nevertheless impossible to predict due to the constant change. Foucault claiming that the apparatus is inert sounds like another paradox, given how strong he claims that the force is behind it. But I think he means that each point only has minimal influence over every other point. So the entire system is collectively very powerful, but it can be simultaneously inert because each interconnected point is weak by itself. Only the interconnected system as a whole is strong. Power is self-reproducing because each moving part is always exerting influence over every other moving part. They don't stop trying to gain more power. The interconnected process never stops. So, probably due to all this complexity, Foucault clarifies what he does not mean by power at the end of this paragraph. Then he gives a more simplified definition, but it isn't really the full extent of the way he looks at it. It's helpful to at least try to understand the phenomenally detailed and complicated metaphor. However, if one of your main takeaways from this video is the simple definition, that's awesome, especially if you think about the web of interconnected force relations. Foucault says that power is not an institution, structure, or strength with which we are endowed. It is a complicated strategical situation within a specific culture. So he's reiterating his claim that power is not just an evil institution or system that is embedded within our lives and minds. It's a complex strategy in a particular society. It's an interconnected web of force relations through which influence flows in multiple directions. Power works differently depending on the specific culture in which it is operating. Also, let's remember that Foucault doesn't think that power is always bad. It only is if a government uses it to control its citizens. But it can be good if people are exerting power over each other during sex and deriving pleasure from it. Power is complex, can be good or bad depending on how it is used, and works differently in different cultures. All right, so I'll stop here for now. I know that this is a long episode, but it takes a lot of time to explain Foucault's perspective on power. I hope that you appreciate the nuanced way that he looks at the concept, along with how often people get it wrong in so many different ways. I'm probably going to do several more videos on this book because I marked so many damn pages when I was reading it because it's so good. I hope you all find Foucault's analysis on how cultural attitudes towards sex have changed throughout history to be as fascinating as I think it is. Thanks so much to everyone for watching this Mindgasms vlog, and thanks so much to everyone who likes, shares, comments on this video, and subscribes to my channel. Also, thanks so much to anyone who subscribes to me on Patreon. I'll add the link in the description for this video like I always do. And to those of you who have already done so, that all really helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate it. And you have no idea how great that is. So, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. Also, think about sex, power, and the state. All right, everyone. Keep having mindgasms and spreading your mindgasms all over the place. And adios until next time.